Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on embracing the future of work and specifically hybrid working. I should perhaps also say Happy Freedom Day, depending on how you see these things, as of course today is aptly the day on which many lockdown restrictions are lifted. Certainly in England, appreciate there are different rules in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. If we can move to the next slide, please. So in terms of our speakers for today, I'm David Williams-Richardson. I'm an employment tax partner here at RSM. I'm joined today by my colleagues Hannah Gibson-Patel, Candice Eacham-Gould, Joe Webber and Charlie Barnes. And I'm also delighted to welcome our special guest today, Emily Perrett from NMI. So welcome to everyone. Move to the next slide, please. So in terms of agenda for today, what we want to do is to emphasise the importance of making a collective decision around your approach to hybrid working. So I'm going to give an initial overview of what hybrid working is all about in a moment and why we think it's so important to formulate your approach in collaboration with your colleagues across your business. So we're then going to give an overview of the various considerations. And we're going to look at it from an HR, a tax, and an employment law perspective. And then our jewel in the crown for this morning will be a discussion with Emily from NMI. And we're going to hear from Emily how she and her team have been tackling this journey towards a hybrid working policy. So if we can flick on. So before we get started, a couple of points to make you aware of. Firstly, we are recording the session this morning and that will be made available after the session. I also wanted to remind you that you are able to submit questions today as well. And we'll attempt to run through as many of those questions as possible at the end of the session. Now, questions can be submitted by clicking on the Q&A function button that you should be able to see on the right hand side of your screen now. And if that doesn't immediately show up, then as you can see from the slide, you can click the three dots button at the bottom of the screen on the right hand side, select Q&A as highlighted by the arrow there, and that should all work fine. Now I'm quite conscious of the fact that we do sometimes get a lot of questions on these sessions, which is great, but we're not always able to answer them, and today we are also confined to an hour for the presentation. So what I would say is that if we're unable to answer any of your specific questions, or if you'd rather ask it on a one-to-one basis, then please feel free to contact any members of the team today, and we'll be happy to help. Okay, so let's make a start on the sessions. So we're talking today about hybrid working. But what exactly do we mean by hybrid working? It's a term that's a relatively new term, and it's being bandied around all the time. I think basically hybrid working is about flexible working. It's about working that allows employees to split their time between attending a traditional workplace, such as the office, and working remotely, for example, working from home. And as you'd expect, this move from traditional working arrangements to hybrid working has been rapidly accelerated since the outbreak of COVID. And just picking up on some stats around that. So as an example, prior to COVID, it was estimated that around 65% of the UK employers offered no flexibility, no flexibility or hybrid working arrangements at all. So that's 65% of UK employers. If you then contrast that with the latest polls, which are suggesting that around 60% of employees have an expectation that they will be able to have some sort of flexible working going forward, then you can immediately see that this is a really important issue. It's an issue that means that you need to establish a new approach and importantly formulate what your hybrid working policy is going to be. We move on to the next slide. So as I've already mentioned a couple of times, we see very much a need for a collective consideration around this. Firstly, deciding whether hybrid working is right for you as the employer and also right for your employees. And if it is right, then you need to collectively agree and document your policy around all of these issues that are on this slide. So basically, going around this slide, what you need to do as a starting point is to establish your underlying principles. What is your policy going to be? You then need to consider the HR, the employment tax, and the legal implications. And we're going to talk through each of those in a bit more detail throughout this presentation. And there are, of course, other considerations which we've got on this slide. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. But if you take, for example, IT security, if you have employees who are working remotely overseas in certain jurisdictions, is the fact that they're using IT in that jurisdiction potentially making your whole system vulnerable? It's certainly worth thinking about. And of course, there are major considerations around your office space. How do you best utilize existing space? And if you are reducing your office space, which many people are doing at the moment, how do you ensure that you have appropriate facilities for collaborative working going forward? All of these things, really need to be thought about. So we move on to the final slide on this section. So at a very high level, what we suggest is that from a practical perspective, you should be taking into account the following considerations on this slide. So firstly, consider what is right for your organisation and what's right for your employees. You then need to engage collectively with appropriate stakeholders within the business. And again, employees need to be part of that process. You then need to agree and ideally document your new hybrid working policy, and that needs to take into account the various considerations that we're going to cover this morning. And finally, it's really important to keep this under review. People are very keen on this at the moment, but is that going to be a sustained thing, or is that going to change? So hopefully that completes the initial overview of what we're dealing with here. And what we're now going to do is to start to look at some of the specifics in a bit more detail. And I want to hand you over to Hannah and Candice.
Thanks, David, and I'm delighted to be joined by Candice today. And in the conversations I've been having with clients over recent months, these are the key themes that are coming through. So working through clockwise then from the top, feedback and communication. This has been front and centre throughout the pandemic as we've needed to adapt to new ways of working almost overnight. But for HR, this really needs to remain the primary focus to ensure that we bring everyone on the journey with us. At RSM, we've been regularly surveying employees throughout the past 16 months to understand how our colleagues want to work in the future, what's working, what's not working so well, and the concerns that we may have around returning to the workplace. And from an organisational perspective, I don't think it's possible to overinvest in communication during times of change and uncertainty. Once we've gathered employee sentiment, we then need to build it into our decision making and then feedback across the organisation what we're hearing, what might be changing, and critically the rationale for our decisions. If we've arrived at the decision for employees to be in the office for 2 or perhaps 3 days a week or more, on what basis are we making that decision? What's their purpose in being in the workplace for those days? And using technology such as online surveying tools, which we've been providing for clients, it keeps the feedback loop short, and following up then with manager one-to-ones to ensure employees are heard is really crucial. Candice, here in the UK, we've seen a significant increase in job postings from pre-pandemic conditions. I think they're up something like 30% and even higher for HR positions, which is fairly unsurprising. But some people are also indicating we're on the verge of a recruitment crisis. I guess the risk, if we don't get this right, is that our employees might vote with their feet in this buoyant candidate market.
Thank you, Hannah, and I'm so pleased to be here today with all of you. And to start, I can't agree with you more. It's not possible at this stage to overinvest in communication. To answer your question, globally, we're starting to see an increase in recruitment for specific roles. Many of the roles that are opening up are those that require specialist experience and scarce skill sets. The success of the ability to work remotely has opened up those scarce skills roles to a much wider geographic region. And now many multinationals are relooking their strategies for top talent acquisition to specifically search a broader area. And this comes then with the need to consider the HR, legal, and tax consequences of hiring outside of the local environment. But of course, this is also providing HR with a new challenge as competitors in the talent market begin to threaten retention. So redesign of purposeful retention planning is also on the increase there.
Yeah, that's right. And I know Joe's going to come on to some of those things a little bit later. But this brings us on quite nicely to the next focus of well-being and engagement. Sadly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, mental health is worse this side of the pandemic than it was before, and it wasn't even good then. Statistics indicate that 1 in 5 adults have experienced some form of depression in early 2021, and this figure's more than doubled compared to before the pandemic. So whilst we've seen some real wins from remote working, such as more social and leisure time, or being able to adjust our working day to fit our more natural rhythms or family schedules, it's also brought some real challenges too. Employees have found themselves working longer hours, perhaps sometimes in far less than ideal environments, unable to switch off, and with constant screen fatigue as we jump from one virtual meeting to the next. So this is definitely a double-edged sword. And some of the clients I've spoken to are having to initiate some really comprehensive solutions in this area, not only in setting some parameters around good practice, taking breaks during the day and so on, but also encouraging or facilitating things like yoga or exercise classes. And then furthermore, implementing employee helplines or even employing clinical psychologists. One NHS client I spoke to last week is now monitoring absence on a daily basis. This is a really big topic and we don't have time to do it justice now, but is there one thing you think we should be doing to build this into our strategy and approach? It's certainly something we now need to build into manager skill sets, isn't it?
Yes, employee engagement has really come to the forefront of the minds of many employers, and certainly something to be really intentional about. And if I had to say one aspect of employee engagement that's been a real step change in employer-employee relationships, it is the focus on employee health and well-being. And you're absolutely right. There's been a drive to ensure that people are encouraged and sufficiently skilled enough to support their colleagues in being able to recognize when support is needed, as well as what to do in that instance. And I do expect that as we begin to see hybrid models appearing, that the employers with strong relationships with their employees will continue to focus on health and well-being and to decentralize that responsibility by ensuring that there's a higher duty of care at managerial level in this regard. And the decentralization of that duty of care is going to be an interesting challenge as it really broadens the responsibility of the employee experience and the expectation of authenticity in caring for colleagues as an inherent aspect of leadership.
Absolutely. So moving on then to inclusion. Now, Candice, this is really your area of expertise. And again, unfortunately, statistics have shown that the pandemic has had a detrimental impact on women who have taken more responsibility for childcare. And of course, we've seen greater numbers of people in BAME and Asian populations actually impacted by COVID itself. We also know that those with disability and underlying health conditions have needed to be shielded and protected. And so as we open up the workplaces and consider how we manage the dynamics of this blended approach, how do we ensure we don't unintentionally discriminate or unlevel the playing field that we've worked so hard to level out over recent years?
Yeah, well, Hannah, remote work allows for the decline in significance of geographic location, which brings the opportunity to remain competitive in the tough talent market by looking further afield. And that in itself does provide a great way to boost diversity in many different ways. And you're absolutely correct. There is a real need to think hard about how return to the workplace could unintentionally affect people in minority or underrepresented groups. So in designing hybrid models, employers should consider the effect of various scenarios on people with disabilities and health conditions, people who may live in cheaper areas far away from business hubs and the associated time and cost of transport, of course, primary caregivers, and even catering specifically to COVID long haulers. And it may be that within one organization, there are many different models of hybrid working, and of course, how to be inclusive, and particularly to put in place measures to avoid proximity bias should be an inextricable part of a hybrid work plan to make sure that those who are not physically present are not overlooked when it comes to development and opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually the organizational culture impact of these new ways of working has definitely been a concern, or at least a key consideration for the clients I've been speaking with. How do you translate a culture which can be so entrenched in the physical environment into an online platform or a mixture of the two? But I think we have a real opportunity now to think about what the culture of our organization is, what we want it to be, and then think through how we embed that through the new patterns of working. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, Hannah. There are real opportunities in the space of organizational culture and how the employment relationship and communication has shifted over the last 18 months. People have been communicating in shorter bursts more often, creating virtual and physical spaces for collaboration and innovation is certainly going to play a bigger role in future. And it will also change even, as David mentioned, what office layouts look like. We've discussed top talent mobility is a pressing issue, and we may start to see more of these hybrid models purposefully catering towards the gig worker, where the outcome of the work is the focus. And in those instances, the employer culture and the opportunity for development or experience would be the major draw cards for those people. And when it comes to culture, employers would really benefit from including in their strategy plan how to ensure employees understand their individual significance in the contribution they make to the shared purpose and objectives of the entity that they serve.
Yeah, and actually individual purpose has really come to the fore during the pandemic because we've seen the lines blurred between personal and professional lives, and people are asking, does this job work for me? Do I care about what I do for a living? And increasingly the bar's rising and people are saying my work has to fit in with my life's purpose. And that creates an interesting opportunity for employers to help people figure that out and to find more purpose in the work that they're doing on a daily basis. And we are all on a continuous learning journey, aren't we? And before COVID, organizational agility was something we'd started to talk about, but there's nothing like a global pandemic to test our thinking and approach, is there?
Hannah, you're absolutely right. This has certainly been a test. And as you know, the trends that we're seeing are not new, but they have evolved at a much faster pace than we had expected. We've been talking about mobility of employees, the effect of hyper-transparency and hyper-connectivity. But in 18 months, it's become a daily reality, and we've learned to do things differently. And I think at the heart of each of these considerations we've chatted about is the trust relationship between the employer and the employee, with employers and employees who have high levels of mutual trust looking to benefit the most at present and in future from higher employee engagement. And employer and employees who listen to and engage with each other is also going to be really important. Probably the most important aspect in considering hybrid work models is that we've been in a cycle of adaptation. So one size fits all is unlikely to be appropriate throughout an organization, but ensuring that there's still fairness and consistency in how flex or hybrid options are applied is important. We've learned some hard lessons about change, and hybrid models should really be rolled out with communication that employees should anticipate that policies will continue to shift and change over time as business needs change in a much more fluid way than what we've seen in the past. And this also makes HR consultants such as yourself a really useful asset for clients in the design and implementation of strategies, policies, and procedures that are expected to continue to evolve.
Yeah, there's some great points in there, and change, as always, is definitely here to stay. I think for me, as we move through the continuing cycle of change and experimentation, we need to ensure we're regularly monitoring data as well to inform our decision making, not only employee sentiment, as we were talking about earlier on, but obviously business and personal performance too. And what's your dashboard telling you? How can you adjust things again to refine or improve them further, and so on? We're all learning to do things differently, so being really clear and intentional about the outputs we're seeking, but all within the context of a clear organisational purpose, helps to keep focused on the goal as we navigate the journey. And if we're not ready to make changes yet, then let's tell employees what we're thinking and when we're going to come. So I'm conscious of time, and there's still so much to be packed into today. So let's pick up on some of these things later on in the summer, Candice. And in the meantime, David, I think it's back over to you.
Yeah, thank you both very much. Very interesting food for thought there. Changing direction now. So what I want to do now is think about the employment tax aspects of this. And from an employment tax perspective, this move to hybrid working is most likely to involve decisions that are going to impact the permanent workplace, the provision of equipment to your employees, and the payment of expenses and allowances. And it's really important that you provide the clarity on your position on each of these issues, and of course consider the tax reporting and the cost implications of these changes as well. So working clockwise around this slide, you should firstly consider any impact on the permanent workplace. So it's likely that your current employment contracts will refer to an office as the permanent workplace. And of course, expenses paid for travel from home to a permanent workplace are always taxable. So if you're looking to change an employee's permanent workplace, perhaps to their home, you're going to need to demonstrate that they're required to perform substantive duties at home as an objective requirement of the job. And this can be quite difficult to demonstrate. You're also going to need to consider the impact if, like many businesses that we're talking to at the moment, you're going to require employees to come into an office, perhaps a couple of times a week or so. And this may mean that their current office will continue to be regarded as a permanent workplace, because the rules there are around, is attendance frequent and does it follow a pattern? You next need to consider what equipment you're going to provide to employees and whether this will have any employment tax implications. So if you provide home office equipment directly to enable the employee to perform their duties, and you retain ownership of that equipment, and any private use of that equipment by the employees is not significant, then there's a specific tax exemption that will apply. What we've seen quite frequently though throughout COVID is that the employer has instead asked the employee to go out and buy the equipment, and the employer has then reimbursed the employee for that cost. And that's slightly different, and that's different rules here. And ordinarily such reimbursement would result in a tax charge, but the government introduced a temporary relaxation which is in place but only up until 5th of April 2022. And importantly, it's worth remembering that this relaxation is conditional on the offer of the reimbursement being made available to all of your employees generally on similar terms. So if you only agree to reimburse the cost for a certain group of your employees, then that potentially doesn't meet the conditions of this temporary exemption. We next have the consideration of whether you make a contribution or not to your employees' household running expenses. And there's been lots of debate around this. So as an employer, you can make tax-free payments of £26 a month without receipts to cover reasonable household expenses. But this is conditional on the employee carrying out duties at home under a formal home working arrangement. And this typically will require a formal home working arrangement document, and that should require that they have to work from home regularly. Now, ordinarily, this exemption for home running expenses only applies to payments made by the employer. But again, the government introduced a temporary relaxation which enables employees to make a personal claim for tax relief, but only if they have to work from home because of COVID. It doesn't apply if effectively they're working from home out of personal choice. And again, that temporary concession for the employee to make the claim is only available until 5th of April 2022. So you need to consider, how you're going to approach that. So working around the wheel, one of the really important considerations is the international aspects, and Joe's going to cover that in a couple of moments' time. And there's also the employment aspects, which Charlie's going to cover very shortly. The final point I want to make from an employment perspective is the need to consider the potential impact of hybrid working on demand for employee benefits. And we're already beginning to see this. So, for example, demand for company cars, demand for workplace car parking, and perhaps season tickets for train travel to work, all potentially being impacted. And other benefits may become attractive. So that certainly should be on your agenda around this. And I think the final point here is once you've reached your collective view on all of this, as we've stressed today, it's really important to capture all of that into an expense policy. So Charlie, over to you on the legal side.
Thanks, David, and good morning, everyone. So yeah, there's a couple of sections that I've just picked up on here where there are legal risks that need to be addressed with regards to hybrid working, and I'd just like to focus on four key aspects really. The first of those is what will be the contractual position that you will take. Section 1 of the Employment Rights Act requires an employment contract to state what the employee's place of work is. Now, whilst the government's guidance has been to work from home if you can, employers have been unlikely to have made any contractual changes to that effect. But now that guidance has been lifted for England, employers will need to consider what the contract should say with regards to the place of work if they are adopting a hybrid approach. So will that be home, will it be at the office, will it be a combination of both? And how will that be split? Now, as David's just said, there are the employment tax issues that need to be considered. So it's about working with your employment tax team or your employment tax advisor just to understand what impact those contractual changes may have, and just to make sure that those two issues are aligned. The second risk for employers is an operational one that I wanted to pick up on, which is managing flexible working requests. Now, all employees have the right to make a flexible working request after 26 weeks continuous service, and employees who have believed over the last 18 weeks they've been able to work just as productively from home as they would have done in the office may start exercising this right more if they wish to continue to do so, but they're being asked to work more from the office. Now, whilst there's no legal obligation on the employer to agree to a request, it should still be considered in accordance with the proper legal process. Otherwise, it can expose employers to the risk of claims for failing to reasonably consider a flexible working request, and in some cases also indirect sex discrimination claims. But those risks can be mitigated and also managed by the use of pulse surveys to understand the general mood of how your employees would like to work going forward, as Hannah mentioned earlier on. And those survey outcomes can help then shape your decision on the future strategy with regards to hybrid working and remote working. And hopefully through that, you will draw out any of those flexible working requests that might have been made had you not conducted those surveys and had you not introduced a policy following on from the outcomes of those surveys. So that's just something to bear in mind. The third aspect I did want to pick up on, which we talked about already this morning, is addressing the discriminatory risks. And I think these are ones that may not necessarily be so apparent at first glance, and it does require a bit of thinking and a bit of engagement, not only with HR and legal, but also engagement with all of your staff. And the first risk arises from remote workers potentially being less visible than those who are working from the office, and historically that's been the case. And that has sometimes resulted in some losing out on promotions or pay rises. And according to the Office of National Statistics, women have in the past been more likely to work from home than men, possibly due to childcare obligations that they've taken on. And as we move to a more hybrid way of working, that creates a greater risk of more women than men working from home in a hybrid way. And if that then leads to more people working remotely losing out or likely to lose out on promotions, pay rises, that can give rise to indirect sex discrimination claims. So that's something to be aware of and a hybrid working policy sitting alongside learning and development for managers can be used to mitigate these risks. It raises awareness of the issue, educates on the steps to be taken to avoid any bias towards office-based workers. Also, it can indicate to the workforce where any of these concerns can be raised confidentially, so through your whistleblowing policy, and that helps by raising awareness of it amongst your staff. It also helps in those issues or helps ensure those issues don't go unnoticed and they can be tackled before they grow into wider problems. Another discrimination risk is disability discrimination. Employers have a positive duty to make reasonable adjustments to a disabled worker's terms and conditions of employment or their working environment, and that reasonable adjustment is to remove any significant disadvantage that's created by their disability. In addition, we've talked about this also, there's the impact of long COVID to consider, because that can also create a disability discrimination risk for some employers. It's estimated that I think 2 million people already are suffering with long COVID in the UK. That figure likely to rise as the restrictions are lifted. And so employers do need to bear in mind that long COVID could be deemed a disability if it lasts or is likely to last for 12 months or more. So as employers adopt a hybrid working model with employees working from home and the office, issues such as long COVID, there's going to be these additional obligations on them to consider making reasonable adjustments to an employee's working environment. Now, some line managers will be unaware of these obligations, and again, setting out a roadmap for them to follow in a hybrid working policy is a key step towards mitigating that risk. And finally, sort of off the back of that, I think another risk to be aware of is the possibility of a rise in workforce disputes. And I mentioned on this slide section 44 ERA claims, and this is where an employer or worker can bring a claim because they feel as they've been treated to a detriment by their employer because they themselves have taken steps to remove themselves from any serious or imminent danger in the workplace. So the point there being that they consider COVID being a serious and imminent danger to them in the workplace, and as a result might be refusing to come into work. And now we've already seen some of these claims flowing through the employment tribunal, and this is just an example of some of the risks associated with the new way of work that we'll have to adopt in a post-COVID environment. And again, adopting a policy which draws on the views of your staff and educating line managers on how to address some of these issues is a good start to trying to de-escalate some of these issues before they grow into something that's going to be more costly and disruptive, like an employment tribunal claim. So those are just the key things that I wanted to pick up on, but happy to obviously deal with any questions related to some of the others that I've put on that slide afterwards.
So thanks, Charlie. We're moving on to the next slide, please. And Joe.
Thanks, David. Yes, I'm just going to take a few minutes now to cover off the many and varied considerations when we think about hybrid working in the context of global hybrid working or global remote working. So just to be clear, what we're talking about here, as David referred to earlier, is where an individual works remotely in a country different to that of their employment contract. So for an example, if we have an individual who is on a UK employment contract and they decide to go and work remotely in their French holiday home or go and work with family. That's the sort of situation that we're talking about. And really, during the course of the pandemic, we've seen cases of this absolutely explode, but also evolve over time. So at the start of the pandemic, what we were seeing were cases of this arise by individuals who were stuck in various countries around the world as the kind of lockdowns progressed, but also individuals kind of rushing back to be with their families. And now what we're seeing more of actually is individuals who are looking to work globally on a remote basis by choice. So lots of organisations are seeing requests for this coming through. And what I would say is that it's not just companies who already have a global footprint or who will already operate on a global basis. We've worked with a lot of UK-based clients who have discovered certain employees have decided to up sticks and go and work in another country. And as you'd imagine, when you're looking at two different jurisdictions, there are quite a lot of things that you need to think about. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail for time purposes, but I did just want to pick up on a few. So firstly, the individual might create a tax obligation for themselves by working in another country. It's probably more likely if they're a returning national, but what I did want to flag here is that some of you may be aware of this 183-day rule. Just a warning there that is there, but it doesn't apply in every single case. It very much depends on the country combinations and also the facts and circumstances of what that individual is doing and how long they're going to be there. The other thing that this can create is, from an employer perspective, various employer registration obligations and payroll reporting obligations, which actually can kick in quite early. And even if ultimately there might not be any tax due, sometimes after 30 days. So from an employer perspective, that's something to bear in mind. Again, social security, which doesn't follow the same rules as tax. If you've got an individual working in a country different to that of their home employment, it's possible that they may be triggering a social security obligation in that other country. Now, there are various agreements in place, both as part of the kind of EU post-Brexit agreement, but also individually with other countries. But just to be clear on that, an application needs to be made in order for that to apply. So in the instance of the individual who I mentioned, a UK employee working in France, an application would need to be made in order to keep that UK individual in national insurance. Corporate issues again, but this time from a corporate tax perspective. So it is possible for an individual working in another country to create what we call a permanent establishment. So that's a corporate tax presence for the home country company. This is more likely to arise the longer an individual is there, and indeed if the individual is in a senior role, so has the ability to negotiate or conclude contracts, or is in a sales role, but that's something to be very much aware of. A couple of other things to mention: employment law, as Charlie's covered, we're seeing a lot of clients concerned about GDPR and IT security with global remote working, immigration, of course, transfer pricing issues, and then in the other considerations, I wanted to draw out a couple of points there. Policy is an absolute must. My colleagues have already referred to this, but as a company, please do think about what your strategy is from a hybrid working perspective. Will you allow this just from a domestic perspective? Will you allow this globally? And if you are going to allow it globally, ensure that the communications out to the business are right, the approvals that are put in place from a business perspective are correct, and all of the considerations that I've mentioned there and the additional complexities for having individuals working remotely in an overseas jurisdiction are considered as part of that. And finally, just to pick on one point that Candice mentioned, obviously one of the benefits of opening up global remote working has been the opening up of the global talent pool. But again, quite a lot of these considerations can be factored in there. So for example, if you're a UK company and you source some niche talent, say for example in Singapore, and you put them on a UK employment contract, all of these things will need to be considered as part of that. So just in summary, a huge advantage if you are able to offer global remote working or happy to onboard new employees globally, but please be aware that there are lots of things to think about. So with that, I'm handing back to David.
Thank you very much, Jo. We now move to the final session, but this is the really exciting one. So what we thought it would be really useful to do today is to get the perspective from a business that is actually going through this whole journey of hybrid working. So therefore, I'm delighted that Emily from NMI has agreed to join us this morning. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Emily is the HR manager at NMI, and she's been with them for 4 years. She currently leads the UK team and is a key leader in the company's global strategy creation, and is therefore ideally qualified, of course, to help us today. So first of all, welcome, Emily. Thanks for being patient.
Thank you for having me.
That's good. So what I want to do is go through a few questions this morning. So before we get on to where NMI are now with hybrid working, just out of interest, what was your position pre-COVID? Did you permit home working and flexible working?
No, not really. If somebody had a plumber coming out or a delivery they needed to be home for, we would, but we were pretty much 100% in office. We weren't set up for people to work remotely. We had a lot of people working on desktops, so they couldn't have worked flexibly if they'd wanted to. Right.
Okay. So it's a big change for you. So can you talk us through where you're at now on this journey? So you know, in your case, this has moved quite significantly, hasn't it? So, you know, is this still work in progress for you? Have you decided on an interim policy? Where are you at with it all?
Yeah, sure. So we've launched a policy for hybrid working, which is interim in that we've said we will review it again in 6 months' time, and then at that point make a long-term decision based on how it's working out for everyone.
Right. Okay. And this interim working is you know, it's an interesting question, isn't it? It's kind of did you ponder that for quite a while as to whether interim is the right thing rather than going straight to a permanent hybrid working policy?
Yeah, we did. I think we've been forced into remote working now due to the pandemic. So we need to see if once we get back to normal, whatever normal is, whether that does actually work for us as a business, but also for our employees.
Yeah, and that's what I was just going to say, actually. You know, have you reached this decision, you know, at management level, or has this been largely employee driven? And have you done any employee surveys, for example?
Yeah, so this has been largely employee driven. Since March last year, we've done something called a Fireside Friday, which is a 30-minute all company Zoom call led by our CEO. And at these, we talk about business results, we do team spotlights, wins of the week. And at the end of each one, we do a Q&A. And we found even early last year, there was a lot of questions there about the future of remote working. It also came out in our employee engagement survey. We asked the question, what one thing would you change about working at NMI? And we saw a lot of people there say a flexible approach to remote working. And then on top of those, we also did specific remote working surveys for all employees to get their preferences before we made any decisions.
Okay, that's really interesting that you followed that approach. And I guess, you know, as we've touched on, a move to hybrid working is obviously going to impact costs. So, you know, some costs are going to be saved, but in other areas, costs are likely to increase. Have you done any specific work as a business to specifically look at how a move to hybrid working is going to impact costs for the business?
We have, and like you say, there are definitely some savings there and there are some additional costs. We provisioned everyone with a laptop last year when we moved everyone to home working within 48 hours in March. So that's already done and that's out of last year's budget. The cost now will be additional peripherals, so screens, keyboards, chairs that people may need. But we have asked people to consider where they want what. So if they already have multiple screens at home, to think about which of those they would want to bring to the office and whether they truly do need some additional equipment. But yeah, for sure, there will be some financial lift to get everybody set up initially.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, as I said earlier, I think, you know, that the tax rules, being an employment tax person, the tax rules around that can be quite complicated, and you're kind of balancing what works from a practical perspective with that potentially creating a tax implication. So that's interesting to hear. And I suppose within your business, one of the things that, you know, we're hearing is, you know, that there may be different groups of your employees who are impacted in different ways. So have you identified any particular roles where hybrid working isn't practical for your employees? And if that is the case, how on earth, you know, are you managing expectations around that?
So unfortunately, yes, we have. These roles are actually few and far between. They're roles that are needed in office, like a receptionist. We mapped every role across the organisation with each executive against specific criteria. So whether interactions can be done digitally, the degree of autonomy in the role, the degree of cross-functional working, and then calibrated this for consistency. And then the key here was really around communication and letting people know why. So if they weren't able to have hybrid working, why that was the case, and we used the mapping to kind of evidence that and have those conversations.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that settles down over a period of time once this becomes actual practice. Now, NMI is an international business, and I know that you have offices in North America. Just out of interest, have you adopted a global approach to hybrid working? Are you finding the same demands overseas, or have you seen different attitudes and requirements in different jurisdictions?
It's been largely the same in terms of employee attitude. Our approach is global. We've launched a global policy. There are slightly different requirements in each location. However, we've been able to approach it in the same way. So we've just taken some requirements, for instance, data protection in the UK, and we've made that a global part of our global policy.
Yeah, it's something that we're seeing a lot, and Joe's touched on it, where we've got clients who perhaps have set up a policy from a UK perspective. And we've been working with our colleagues throughout the RSM network to say, okay, well, do the rules work in your country? And inevitably they don't, and there might be extra reliefs in one country that we don't have here, and vice versa. So I think it's a very interesting area to look at. And kind of touching on expenses, and I mentioned this earlier in the employment tax section. Have you specifically changed your expense policy to cover issues such as home working costs and the provision of equipment, or is that something that you're kind of focusing on the policy itself, and that will be further down the line?
So yeah, we haven't yet. So we provided equipment that was needed last year. And at the moment, while home working is necessary and we have a no travel policy in place, we just haven't needed to. It's definitely on the to-do list, but I think travelling to customer meetings seems a little way off yet.
Yeah, and will it ever happen again, I suppose, is
yeah,
to think about. And again, because of the international nature of the business, have you had any instances that Joe touched on of employees wanting to work from home where home is overseas? And if so, how are you managing those?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of people actually within Europe who wanted to go home and see family and work from there. We'd put out an internal policy to say that employees had to request this and then inform us of when and where, so we had visibility and could track it for compliance purposes. So I know there's this 183 days rule that Joe mentioned, but that doesn't apply for all types of roles. So we've generally limited it to 30 days without the need for a further more specific approval. But actually in practice, we haven't had anyone go over about 14.
Okay, it's interesting. I think it's probably one of those areas where we'll see overseas tax jurisdictions perhaps cotton onto this, because they will begin to see that this is happening more often, particularly in the more popular jurisdictions such as France and Spain are areas where some of my clients seem to have employees. Okay, we touched on the importance of communication around this, and I think sometimes it tends to be overlooked a bit. Can you just talk us a bit through a bit more detail about how, from a practical perspective, you've communicated this with your employees?
Yeah, sure. So we've done it in a number of ways, actually. So we have surveyed and surveyed and surveyed some more. We've done manager feedback loops. We've talked about it on our fireside chats on Fridays, where we've had that open Q&A. When we launched the policy, we talked everybody through the process, how we made those decisions, that mapping criteria that I spoke about earlier, and then the key aspects of the policy before we actually circulated that document. And then we asked managers to hold meetings to then discuss it at a team level and set expectations. it is a change management process, but it is also something that most employees wanted. So it was viewed as a positive, especially due to our previous in-office culture.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and one of the other areas that that Hannah and Candice touched upon is how you're dealing with employees, and I guess I'm very interested to know how you've dealt with any shift in responsibilities of line managers. Do you envisage the need for line managers to have different training on their responsibilities, because it's quite different being a line manager when you have people physically in an office as opposed to line managing remotely. How have you managed that?
Yeah, so I think that leadership has already changed. We've all learned as we've gone to some extent because we've had to. We're definitely having to be more intentional when leading remote teams. So setting up time for one-to-one conversations and team calls, and then making sure there's time for that informal chit chat too.
Right.
Managers are having to think more and more about well-being and mental health, as Hannah was talking about, and more about the individual rather than just getting the work done. They're having to focus on output and results rather than the hours physically spent in the office. And it's definitely a positive shift. We've built trust. A lot of leaders have learned that they do not need to be physically stood behind employees to know how they're working. And I think all of this will and should remain, and I think it will continue to evolve, and therefore our approach will have to continue to flex and evolve with it.
Yeah, no, I think that's really useful. It's fantastic to get those insights from you around that. I guess we want to save some time for, I know there's some questions that come in, but just one more question from me on this is, you're fairly well advanced on this, which is great. Do you have any particular tips for anyone who's on this call who's perhaps yet to start the journey? Is there anything you would particularly focus on?
I think it would just be communication. So involve employees, find out the things that are important to them. Don't make assumptions on what you think they want, or just listen to those people that have the loudest voices. So I think it's surveys, it's feedback loops, and then be prepared to reflect, review, adapt, and change your approach.
Yeah, okay. That's really helpful. So I think that concludes that part of the session. So thanks again, Emily. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Just very quickly, before we get to the questions, I just wanted to briefly talk you through how RSM can help you on this journey of hybrid working. So we collectively work together as the People Advisory Services team, RSM, and we currently work with a number of clients, and we're helping them to implement their hybrid working policy. And just very quickly, by way of example, we can facilitate stakeholder workshops just to help you formulate your policy, covering all of those areas that we've covered today. We also work with clients to review their policies, their processes, and amendments to contracts and the communication material. And of course, as Joe said, we're an international network, so we're quite frequently working with international businesses to basically look at the implications on hybrid working overseas. So if any of this would be of interest, please let one of us know. We've now got 5 minutes left, so I do think we have had some questions coming through. Let me see. So one question that came through fairly early is, do we need a hybrid working policy, as well as a flexible working policy, and a home working policy, and possibly an expense policy as well? Well, let me go first, and I'll be interested if what my colleagues have to say. I think what I'm seeing as an employment tax person is that certainly this move to hybrid working does necessitate a review of how you're going to pay people, what expenses you're going to provide. And I think what we've seen is a lot of perhaps pre-COVID policies are perhaps now not fit for purpose. And if nothing else, they need to be updated and amended. Charlie, any thoughts from you on that question?
Yes, I think from my perspective, obviously flexible working requests, that the legal position on that hasn't changed. So someone could, if you're introducing hybrid working, they can still make a flexible working request. So that policy you will still need. It's just how I suppose you might go about sort of bringing these policies together. As I'm sure everyone would have recognised, our recommendation here is a hybrid working policy is very important for all of the tax, legal and HR issues that we've highlighted today. So it's a question of whether, if you're introducing a hybrid working policy, I think whether your home working policy then morphs into it or becomes an amalgamation of it, and then what you do with your flexible working policy. But from a legal perspective, I would say you still need to have a separate flexible working policy, because even if you introduce hybrid working, someone still has the legal right to make a flexible working request if they have 26 weeks continuous service. So, you know, it's what works best operationally, but certainly from a legal perspective, you still need that flexible working policy, and it to be signposted in a way in which employees know where it is and how to review it.
Yeah, that's great. So changing direction, have a question. I think this is a question for you, Joe. So what is the maximum amount of time per year that an employee can work remotely from abroad before considerations that you spoke about need to be made? Now, I know we do have some tracking technology that helps with this, but can you kind of expand on that one for us, please?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably not an easy answer to that one, David, unfortunately. I mean, it very, very much depends on the facts and circumstances of the individual, the role they're carrying out, the country combinations that we're talking about, and therefore the tax rules that apply. So it's very, very difficult to come up with an answer that fits all. So what we've actually seen in a lot of organisations, and as Emily mentioned, is that an organisation will decide on a threshold that they're comfortable with. That they will allow individuals to work remotely on a global basis. It's not necessarily related to any kind of tax or legal requirements, but it's something they feel they can manage from a practical perspective. So something between 15 and 30 days. And then for anything over and above that, what they will do is run detailed assessments based on the facts and circumstances of each individual case to understand what those obligations might be. So it's picking a threshold that's practical, that's not really related to tax legislation, but just makes it easy for the organisation to manage.
Yeah, so I think, you know, it's one of those ones we see, isn't it, on a day-to-day basis. It's the tracking which is the challenging bit. Okay, another one for you here, Charlie. Are we legally obliged to change place of work in contracts to home working? So for those who work less than 50% of the time in the office, it says, can we leave the legal place of work as the office? So what's your thoughts on that one?
Well, technically, the Employment Rights Act does say that if there are changes to those key statement of terms that you put in place when someone starts work, and that would include their place of work, then they need to be updated. Now, when it comes to, if you've simply just got they work from the office and you're going to adopt hybrid working, then you do need to consider making changes to that contract of employment, because it can say, it should say the places where they're permitted to work as well as the office. So from a legal perspective, yes. But then operationally, I suppose you've got to factor in some of the points that you were making, David, on obviously from a tax perspective, how that might have an impact on what you want contracts to say. So I think you've got to factor in the legal risk, but then practically what works best when you're bringing all of these things together, and what you want your contracts to say, and also, you know, what your hybrid policy will say.
Yeah, and I think it's a valid point. I guess this probably you know, it demonstrates quite nicely that the reason why we're saying about collectively considering this, because, you know, from my perspective as an employment tax person, you know, if HMRC start looking at this, then their starting point will tend to be the contracts. So they'll be looking at, okay, well, what is the permanent workplace? They will look at the contract, but then they will also look at the reality situation. So you know, a good point to end on, I guess, in terms of demonstrating that particular point. Now, I'm conscious that we do have some more questions, but we've just literally gone past midday, and I know that everyone is working to a tight timeline. So, what I'd like to do at this point is thank all of the panelists, particularly Emily, for taking the time to join us this morning. Thanks, Emily. And as I said, we're happy to deal with any further questions. So if you contact us, we will be pleased to help with that. But other than that, you can change your preferences. So if you want any mailings from RSM, you can follow this. We have been making a recording, and we will be distributing that shortly. So at that point, I'd like to close this morning, and thank you very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.